Okay, welcome back. I hope you had a very fruitful and enjoyable morning. No, I had. What did we do? We heard about angry Bambis. We understood that it's not necessarily a human right as an artist to be paid. All kinds of, I thought, quite provocative, interesting new ideas. I also know that we're a very engaged bunch over here because I talked to Melissa. Melissa, where are you? Gone. But Melissa, remember Melissa said that we should organize ourselves and change copyright. I understand that she already had 30 people in this room hooking up on a Google initiative. That's fantastic. Okay. This afternoon we still have a great program. We got two fantastic speakers, Eva van Passel, Cédric Menara from Google, and we'll have some really nice Ignite talks before we end up in our Hack for Denmark event. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Eva van Passel. She is with iMinds from the Vrije Universiteit in Belgium. She is from our sector. She talks about our sector. She's mostly about change. How should we change in our sector in order to enable us to survive and to be fruitful in this 21st century? So can I have a big round of applause for Eva van Passel?
Right. My talk today is entitled, How Open is Open Enough? Spoiler alert, I don't really have the answer. I'm trying to talk to you about a philosophy for cultural commons for the cultural heritage sector. I encourage you all to talk about it on Twitter, even things you don't like so much. I can deal with that normally, as long as you're kind. Yeah, that's what I want to mention today. Obviously, the context in which this all takes place, I don't think I need to say so much about. You all decided to sign up to a conference called Sharing is Caring, so you all know that this is something which is really going on in the cultural sector at the moment. Nonetheless, a few points. As a cultural institution, you no longer just have visitors, you really have users, makers, learners, online experience seekers, and that's a completely different ballgame. As Melissa demonstrated so eloquently this morning, there are really people who want to do all kinds of stuff with your collection, which you probably hadn't thought about yourself, and that's a completely different way to deal with the whole idea of being a cultural heritage institution. So the idea is mainly how to get involved, and not just how to get involved, but how to get involved in a manner that is meaningful for our users, for ourselves, for everyone really. And this is really a great challenge for cultural institutions, as I'm sure you all know better than I do. Because contrary to what Harry said, I'm not really from the cultural sector. I'm a researcher, I work at a university. However, I have worked for a lot of years with the cultural sector. I started work at iMinds in 2007, and since then I've worked on a large number of research projects with cultural organizations mainly, but also with artists, etc. I don't want to talk about my background too much, but I do want to highlight a few things because they really inform my vision about all of this. They really lead to my opinions about this philosophy for cultural commons that I want to talk about today. So the first few projects have been more local with institutions in Flanders in Belgium. Belgium's always tricky. I always have to give this little disclaimer. If you have culture in Belgium, it's never about Belgium because cultural competence on a government level is devolved to the communities. So Flanders has completely different cultural policy to Wallonia. Like it or not, it doesn't matter. That's how it is. So my local research is usually always with Flemish cultural institutions. And the projects I worked on have been a lot about digitization, digital long-term archiving, and also what we're here today, making things available in different ways. But unlike Maarten earlier, it's not technical, it's not legal. My perspective is really about the policy and the strategy. I'll get back to that. And after the local projects with all the Flemish stakeholders, I worked with a project aggregating content for Europeana. And in parallel to that, also a project with a contemporary artist. And especially those last two things are what I want to mention today and what have informed my vision. For full disclosure, I used to work at a copyright management organization. It might be quite interesting for you to know. Nothing I'm presenting today has a lot to do with that, but I'm just telling you this because I think it shows that I really try to understand both sides of the coin and both sides of the story. I also do unrelated research to do with screenwriters and directors and how they try and make income in this digital age. And so I can really see both sides of the story, which I think might be useful. So the first thing I want to mention is that Europeana-related project. It was called Europeana Inside, and it was one of many best practice networks that was created to aggregate a lot of content and metadata from a lot of cultural institutions and make it available through Europeana. But this project had a very specific goal in mind, which was really its tagline, and it's reducing barriers to participation. How can we really encourage as many cultural institutions as possible to participate in Europeana? And well, there were a lot of barriers which were trying to be discussed, legal ones, organizational ones, technical ones, financial ones as well. The open data and opening things up fully was never really seen as a barrier because as Europeana had a new data exchange agreement, if you signed up to make your metadata available through Europeana, you signed up for making it available, dedicating it to the public domain, basically using a CC0 license. So the project managers just said, oh, well, so yeah, open data is not a problem. You've all signed up for that. And you could see that some cultural institutions in the room at that very first meeting went, did we? Oh, okay, I wasn't so aware of that. So we tried to look at it anyway and to make sure that the institutions understood what it meant. Because we noticed that especially some museums were really scared because they suddenly realized that the descriptions which they wrote of works of art, which took a curator sometimes a lot of research, a lot of work to really write in detail about something, would now have to be given away. And if that's correct or not, I don't know. I don't want to judge about it, but it scared them a lot. So just the one-size-fits-all approach and making sure that everyone uses the same license makes a lot of sense if you're Europeana and aggregating everything. It makes sometimes slightly less sense simply in the sense that it might scare people. Europeana were always very happy to listen to our concerns and really take that into account in their new sharing frameworks and publishing frameworks. So very interesting. I'm not trying to say that the institutions in the project were unwilling to share, completely not. It's just they were slightly scared sometimes. Which is why it was very interesting that at the very same time, I was also doing a little project with with an artist. And it was very small. I had 3 weeks to do it, I think. And it's a contemporary artist and filmmaker called Jasper Rigol. And he, in fact, is a collector of 8mm films. He goes to flea markets, garage sales, wherever he thinks he can find them, and buys up every 8mm reel of film he can find. So we're not talking anything professional. We're talking people's home movies, right? People filming their children, people filming their weddings, stuff like that. And then what he does with it is he really uses it, all the found footage, into his own artworks. He reappropriates it and he makes collages and he really creates his own art based on it. So the slide, you can see the pictures on there are actually from one of his works called Temps mort, which means dead time. So it's basically all the stuff which is left at the end of film reels when people have filmed what they want to film, but the film's not completely finished yet. So it's ridiculous things like geese walking around for 10 minutes or something like that. And he really made artwork based on that. I find it very fascinating. But why am I telling you about this? Well, because he collected that many films, he decided to create his own fictional cultural institution. So it's just him, you know, he doesn't have any staff or he's not officially recognized by the government, nothing like that. But he founded the International Institute for the Conservation, Archiving and Distribution of Other People's Memories. It sounds really archaic and old-fashioned, and that was kind of intended, you know. He was trying to have a little dig at some of the more archaic tendencies of archives, But then he does realize that he's becoming one as well, because he's collected for 10 years and he needs to store them, and he really understands where they're coming from with their problems. So we got together and we wrote an article together about lessons real memory institutions might learn from his completely fictional case. And we called it something like Fictional Institutions and Institutional Frictions, which I thought was very clever. And we put some things in it about how you can really have a creative approach to opening up and how you could learn from him for that. And the first thing is about attitudes to risk, because it's a really peculiar situation he's in. He's not an actual memory institution, so he's not accountable to the government or to users or to preserving the past. So you would think, well, very low risk. But on the other hand, he's not an actual memory institution, which also means he doesn't benefit from any of the exceptions in copyright law that most of you do benefit from. He's just an individual doing stuff, right? He has really no protection in that sense whatsoever. And yet what he decided to do is make all his orphan works, because that's what they are, available in little clip format via archive.org. So you can download them. They're dedicated a very open Creative Commons license, which in fact he probably can't do because he's not the rights holder. He didn't make these works, but he decided to do it anyway. Did he do a diligent search? I doubt it. How do you even start doing a diligent search about reels of tape you found at flea markets, right? You cannot do that. So, but he decided to do it anyway, and fingers crossed, and I hope I don't jinx him. No one has come and complained yet. You know, he makes his works of art based on it. No one cares, apparently. So, I mean, that's a really good thing, right? And the second thing relates to that. It's the part where he interacts with external platforms, with existing websites, basically. It's something which Europeana really tries to do now as well. They really make sure that content gets pushed through to Flickr, the Commons, and Wikimedia, the Commons, and all of that, because it's a bit of a naive idea to think that all the users are going to come and find you. You're going to have to come and find the users. So that's something which I think he does particularly well. So he allows a reuse like that. But what he then also does is he does have his own website, and he had this idea, which sadly never quite made it into practice, to make all those clips available for adoption. So you could adopt a memory, and preferably one which really linked into your own memory, and then you could tweak it and write it into your own story and say what that memory means. So basically make up your own meaning to someone else's archived footage, which is very interesting. So I think also that that idea of really fostering and encouraging people to do something creative with your work is really excellent, and not just putting it out there and just leave it out there like Melissa said, the scan and dump phase. We're over that. You need to really get people to do things with it. So I thought that was very interesting to point out to you. The reference will be at the back of the slide if you want to read more into that. So all of this is not just to tell you what I've been doing for the past few years, but it's mainly to tell you why I think we need some sort of philosophy of cultural commons. Because what we've noticed is that as cultural institutions, which I work with so much, they're always focusing on the latest trend and the latest challenge and the latest thing that society has thrown to them yet again. Like we need open data, we need openly licensed content, we need an API. Oh no, now we need to be on Instagram. No, not Instagram. We need to be on Tumblr. No, Twitter. What do we do? And every time people start running around thinking, oh, this is what we need to focus on now. And it's always very ad hoc. It's what's the latest trend? What do we need to do? Whereas I think a lot of institutions, due to lack of time and resources and due to having to do all of that, a bit miss the point where it's better to step back and think, what do we want to be as an institution, and what does that mean? So that's why it says there has to be a better way than to just run around after everything, I think. So we thought of a framework for practice and policy to make it easier for institutions to do things perhaps in a similar way. And this is another slide that shows you why that might be useful. I didn't make this slide. Andrea Wallace did. She's right over there on the second row, so by all means speak to her about it. And it's actually a slide of a number of cultural institutions in the UK. I'm sure you cannot read this in detail. That's not the point. It will be made available later. But the fact is that a row is a cultural institution, so you have a lot of cultural institutions, and a column is something which your users might want to do. So it's things like take a picture when they're visiting, make that picture available on their Facebook page, download content from the website, do something creative with that content, and the little color coding tells you whether or not the institution allows it. And you can see that some institutions are more open than others, but you can also see that while there's some columns where everyone has more or less the same idea, a lot of columns are completely different. So every institution takes it in their own different way to decide what's allowed and what isn't. So I think that's very interesting. And also, we were talking earlier about how a lot of people have dual backgrounds, like historian and engineer. Andrea is a graphic designer and a lawyer, and I think that slide really shows that. Very useful skills to combine. So I have kept saying for the last 5 minutes, we thought we should do this. And with we, I want to really point out it wasn't just me, it wasn't just my institution, but I had a really unique opportunity to work with policymakers on this whole idea of cultural commons. And that came about just because they follow a lot of the projects that are ongoing, a lot of the discussions that are ongoing with cultural institutions. And we noticed that we had the same idea of there needs to be a better way, we need something more overarching. So I worked with 2 colleagues from the Agency for Arts and Heritage, who are currently part of the Department of Culture, Youth, Sports and Media, again of the Flemish government. And it wasn't a research project we did together, we just wrote a paper for a conference and decided to take it as a starting point to start thinking about this. We also submitted for a project funding to maybe really start doing this in practice and really get going with this cultural commons idea. We don't know if that will be successful, but we wanted to do this, I already said why, but also from departing from really important key principles, which I think every cultural institution should think about, and that basically is that culture has intrinsic value and access to culture has intrinsic value, and access means different things to different users, and we should be able to allow that when it's possible. And it also means not just now, but also in the long term. But it also means not just access to things that are easy, the public domain, but the audience also has a right to be able to access things that are not necessarily as easy. So those principles are quite important. Now, the next bit has the risk of becoming a little bit theoretical, which I hope I can try and avoid a little bit, but don't worry, I will get back to practice after that. When we decided to start thinking about a mission for cultural institutions, the idea of cultural commons shows up a lot, and it shows up in Europeana discourse as well. I'll refer to that later again as well. But what is it really, and what does it mean, and how do you start building a cultural commons, if that's the right way to put it? Well, and we found interesting academic literature from Madison and his colleagues, and they built this whole framework, which was not meant to build a cultural commons, but from an academic research point of view, to analyze existing cultural commons and to look at something and to see why it is a commons model, why it might work, why it might not work, what is the key defining factors in it. And we thought, and we tried to do that in our paper, I don't know if it's very successful yet because we haven't done it in practice, but we thought we could use that framework really for cultural institutions to start thinking about themselves as building a cultural commons. And there's those 4 structured points which are on the slide, which are effectively what the authors use to analyze these commons, which we think you can think about as a cultural institution. For example, resources and community. Every commons is built up around a set of resources and around a set of community that uses those resources, that contributes to those resources, and that hopes that these resources will remain in existence. And in fact, you can look at this in a different way. You can look at this as an individual institution, but you can also look at this as cultural commons in Europe in a much larger sense. In that case, the resources and the community are pretty much endless, right? We want everything to be part of cultural heritage of Europe. So I think that's interesting to look at. And goals and objectives is the second thing which they really analyze when they look at a cultural commons system. What are the goals? What are the objectives? I think if you try and put it in simple terms, it's rather easy. It's just to try and be openly available to share cultural heritage with our community, with as many people as possible. Obviously, they can be much more specific and you can break that down a lot more. But that's really the basic philosophy which we want to aim for. And I think that's useful to just remind ourselves of as a heritage sector. Does that mean everything must be openly available to everyone all of the time? Of course not. I don't think that's going to really be very realistic. So what I find the most interesting thing in this commons model is the degrees of openness, and that they can vary, and that you can really open up certain things a lot more to certain people, or you can allow a lot more things for educational reuse than you can for other reuse, things like that, that you can really tweak the model. And Creative Commons licenses, obviously commons is in the name, is very good for that. You can really choose what is possible, but not just randomly, but really think about the content and what is appropriate and what the rights holders want from it. And I think it's very good to also see degrees of openness as sort of a decentral thing. So it means that certain people open certain things up and we can link that all together. I will get back to that later as well. And then that word governance, it's always a little bit scary because it sounds like, you know, you're going to look over the shoulders of your users and see what they do. But I think governance is interesting in terms of making sure that people know what they are allowed to do. And again, I think Creative Commons licenses can be useful for that. So sorry if that was a little bit theoretical. Just checking, oh, plenty of time. Just checking now what that means in practice. Ooh, my slide jumped about a little bit. The first thing is, and I've seen this show up on Twitter this morning. Apparently it was discussed at another conference, the famous black hole of the 20th century. And that's this whole thing with digitized content right now. Because the stuff is copyright protected, is tricky. It just doesn't get done. Or if it gets digitized, it gets stuck away in the vault somewhere and no one can actually access it. So I think this is really, really crucial. And this is something which the cultural heritage sector should really take some responsibility for. In a sense that it's difficult enough to do the stuff which is public domain, sometimes just in terms of getting it out there, but at least it's easy in terms of licensing. Copyright's not really an issue, apart from Danish photographers apparently. So, but in general, that's relatively easy. And we've seen earlier today the whole thing of Creative Commons being an opportunity for more contemporary art to really be made available. And it doesn't even have to be Creative Commons, right? Someone said that it can just be contracts. If you are a museum and you sign a contract for the acquisition of a new work of art, even if the artist doesn't want to do it under Creative Commons, you can still agree to be allowed to put it online for certain types of reuse. So that stuff is, relatively speaking, easy, but then you have all that stuff in the middle. And then you have orphan works, which are 20th century. That sometimes can be possible, apart from the fact that you then have to pay thousands of pounds to the UK government to safeguard it. But, you know, but you have so much stuff which is 20th century content, which you know who the rights holders are, but you just, as a cultural institution, don't really want to start licensing. And I think that that's a tricky thing, and that's a dangerous thing. I think that perhaps you have a 20th century artist with an estate who you know is very approachable and who might well be very happy for things to be licensed completely openly if you just ask them. And I know it's something very hard to do for cultural institutions, which are always already very busy, very oversubscribed. But even if it's small things and small volumes, I think it's worth to really start thinking about licensing some of that 20th century content to try and fill up some of that black hole. So I don't know if people have read the Sharing is Caring anthology, which had a lot of articles about things coming out of the previous editions. And those of you who have, or those of you who have followed the Twitter debates on Open Glam and all of that, will have heard Michael Edson's great phrase, think big, start small, move fast. And I think it bears repeating, because it's really what it's all about. You know, you can think about opening up, but if you think about it in a sense that you think you have to do everything right now, completely open, public domain, dedicated CC0, in the end, nobody does anything because they go, we cannot do that. We don't know if that's possible. So just start with something. Start with something either licensed with the artists, or start with something which is relatively low risk, which is public domain, or which is probably public domain, even if you're not in, like, even orphan works have different degrees of risk, right? I would imagine. So things like that, start opening up what you can as soon as you can, even if it's only a selection of 10 works. It's true anyway that massive databases are so hard to search into, so it might be very relevant to just have this really nice highlighted 15 items collection at a really good resolution, which people can really start doing things with. And that, I think, is a very good way for all of us to start opening up. And again, in that Sharing is Caring anthology, Jill Cousins, director of Europeana, wrote this very interesting paper about really looking at Europeana as the cultural commons for Europe and building a cultural commons for Europe. I still think that that should be possible, but I think it's very interesting to look at that completely decentralized and look at that from your individual institution's point of view and think, what can I do to contribute to the cultural commons of Europe? And forget about the thing that it's not useful unless you can put your whole collection out there. Everything which you can add might lead to a reuser, a creative remaker, a DIY hacker person to really get stuck in and make something wonderful with, which might get CC 0 or other Creative Commons license, and will just then also be part of our cultural commons, will become part of the European cultural commons. And I think that that's a really noble thing to strive for, even on a small scale. So don't be too scared, just get in there and do something. And this slide I've used in previous slideshow as well. I think this is a tempting path. That's what I tell myself anyway. So I show it to people and say, it's a tempting path, just walk down it. There's no monster at the end of it, just have a little look. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eva. Those were some